She was my neighbor, graceful, confident, and years ahead of me in life. I only meant to be polite when I called her Mrs., but she laughed, touched my arm, and said softly, "Stop calling me that. You make me feel ancient." That was the moment everything between us began to change. I first noticed her in the quiet rhythm of an ordinary afternoon. The sun was still high, its light spreading a soft, golden haze across the row of houses, and I was carrying out the trash when I caught sight of her tending to her garden. She stood by the fence, sleeves rolled up neatly, hands buried in the dark soil as though the world beyond those flower beds barely existed. Something about the scene stopped me mid-step, not in a dramatic way, but in that subtle pull when your senses tell you there's more in front of you than just another neighbor going about her day. She looked to be in her early 40s, though there was a graceful maturity in the way she moved that made age feel irrelevant. Her hair was tied up casually, strands escaping to brush her cheek when the breeze picked up. She had a calm energy about her, the kind of presence that steadies the space around it. I told myself I was only being polite as I walked over to the fence, but deep down, I think curiosity pushed my feet forward. "Good afternoon, Mrs. _____." I greeted, my voice carrying a respectful tone that came naturally. She straightened slowly, brushing soil from her palms onto her jeans before looking at me. Her eyes caught the sunlight, holding it in a way that made them almost too bright to meet directly. And then she smiled, not just with her mouth, but with that softened expression people wear when they've already measured you and decided you're safe. But instead of a simple, "Hello?" she tilted her head, narrowed her eyes playfully, and said, "Stop calling me Mrs. You make me feel ancient." Her words landed lightly, almost like a tease, yet there was a quiet truth behind them. I felt my ears warm. "Oh, sorry. Habit," I muttered, scratching at the back of my neck. "It's fine," she said with a small laugh, her voice rich, low, touched by amusement. "Just call me by my name. It's been a long time since anyone made me feel like I needed a title." It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Her tone carried a mix of humor and something else, something unspoken. Vulnerability? Weariness? I couldn't tell, but it stirred a reaction in me that was more than embarrassment. It made me want to look at her again, longer this time. For a moment, we both stood there with the fence between us, the silence filled by the sound of leaves rustling and a bird's cry in the distance. The smell of damp earth mixed with the faint perfume of the flowers she had been tending. "You've got a good garden going," I said finally, searching for something that wouldn't betray how thrown off I felt. "Thank you," she replied, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "Keeps me grounded." Then, with a subtle smile, she added, "And a reason to talk to nosy neighbors." I laughed, maybe too quickly, but the air between us lightened. She leaned casually against the wooden fence, and though nothing about her posture seemed intentional, it was impossible not to notice the natural ease in the way she carried herself. Confident yet approachable. Mature yet far from ancient. As I walked back inside later, her words echoed in my head, "Stop calling me Mrs." It seemed such a small thing to say, yet it shifted the way I saw her entirely. No longer just the neighbor's wife. She became something else, someone who didn't want to be defined by roles, by expectations, by age. Someone who invited me, without even knowing it, to see her for who she really was. And I realized maybe that was the first time I truly had. After that first exchange, something shifted between us. It wasn't obvious, not in the way neighbors suddenly become friends overnight, but in subtler rhythms, the kind you only notice when you look back. Over the next week, our paths kept crossing in ways that felt both ordinary and strangely deliberate, as though the neighborhood itself was nudging us into orbit around one another. The first was at the mailbox. I was fumbling with a bundle of envelopes when she walked up, a basket balanced on her hip, filled with herbs and tomatoes from her garden. She offered me a sprig of basil through the slats of the fence, her fingertips brushing mine as I accepted it. "Fresh always tastes better," she said lightly, her voice carrying the ease of someone who had long ago learned how to turn the smallest moment into something memorable. The scent of basil clung to my hand long after she walked back inside. Another time, I noticed her struggling with 2 heavy bags of soil in her driveway. I crossed over before I could think twice, offering to carry them to the backyard. She hesitated, pride flickering across her face, then relented with a smile that looked both grateful and reluctant. "I don't usually let people help," she admitted, watching me set the bags down near her flower beds. "But I'll make an exception." The way she said it, half teasing, half serious, made my chest feel warm. Soon, these casual exchanges became a rhythm of their own. When I watered my small row of potted plants, I'd glance over to see her crouched among her roses, humming softly to herself. When she noticed I was out of town for a day, she collected my mail and left it neatly stacked by my door, a simple act that carried more weight than I could explain. And each time we spoke, the formality between us seemed to peel away. She never mentioned my age, never brought up the difference in years. Instead, she asked about my work, about my family, about my clumsy attempts to keep my succulents alive. She listened, really listened, tilting her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she was paying attention. It was disarming, the way she made even the smallest details feel worth sharing. The more I noticed her, the more details etched themselves into memory. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes deepening when she laughed. The way she squinted against the sun, lifting a hand to shield her face but forgetting a streak of dirt across her wrist. The way she carried herself with a quiet assurance, as though she had no interest in impressing anyone, and somehow, that made her unforgettable. One evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, she leaned against the fence with a mug of tea in her hand. "It's nice, isn't it?" she murmured, nodding at the horizon where the sky bled into streaks of lavender and gold. I found myself leaning against the same fence, mirroring her posture without meaning to. "Yeah," I replied softly, though I wasn't sure if I meant the sunset or the rare comfort of standing beside her. In these little moments, passing herbs, exchanging mail, standing in silence, it became clear that we were no longer just neighbors. A quiet ease had grown between us, built not from grand gestures but from the steady presence of someone who made the ordinary feel extraordinary. And though I didn't dare name it yet, I could feel something stirring beneath the surface, something I wasn't sure either of us had expected. It was a Saturday morning when she leaned over the fence and asked, almost too casually, if I knew how to fix a squeaky door hinge. I hesitated, unsure if it was a polite question or an invitation. But the way her eyes lingered on mine, the slight curve of her lips, told me she wasn't just making conversation. "If you've got a moment," she added, brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead, "I could use a hand inside." I agreed before I had time to think about it. Stepping into her house for the first time felt different from seeing her across the fence. The air was warm, touched with the faint smell of coffee and lavender. Everything about the space felt lived in and personal. The framed photographs along the hallway, the worn rug at the entryway, the stack of books on the coffee table. It wasn't spotless, but it wasn't messy either. It carried the softness of a home built around comfort rather than display. She led me toward the back door, where the hinge gave its complaint with every push. I crouched down, examining the screws, but my attention kept drifting. She stood close by, leaning against the wall with her arms folded, watching me work. There was nothing overt in her stance, yet her presence filled the space so completely that I became hyper-aware of every sound, the squeak of the hinge, the faint hum of the refrigerator, even the quiet rhythm of her breathing behind me. "You're good at this," she said after a moment, her tone somewhere between playful and sincere. "I've fixed enough of these to know a trick or two," I replied, trying to focus on the task but feeling the weight of her gaze on my shoulders. "Still," she murmured, "I don't usually let people help me with these kinds of things." Her words hung in the air, more revealing than I think she intended. I glanced back at her, and for a second our eyes met. Something passed between us, something fragile, something unspoken. Then she looked away, as if catching herself. I tightened the last screw and gave the door a push. The hinge swung quietly, obediently, no longer protesting. "There," I said, standing and wiping my hands on my jeans. She smiled, a soft curve that reached her eyes. You make it look easy. Before I could answer, her hand brushed my arm as she stepped forward to test the door herself. It was the lightest touch, almost accidental, yet I felt it burn through the sleeve of my shirt. She didn't move her hand away immediately. Instead, she steadied herself as if testing not just the door, but me. The moment stretched longer than it should have, then dissolved into a small laugh. See? Quiet as new. She closed the door gently, the silence almost too sharp after the squeak we'd grown used to. I followed her into the living room, where she poured me a glass of water without asking, setting it on the coffee table in front of me. You've earned it, she said lightly. I sat on the edge of the couch, glancing at the photographs on the mantel. Family gatherings, vacations, moments from a life I didn't know. They spoke of history, of stories and people she'd lived alongside. I felt like an outsider, yet she made no effort to keep me at a distance. You've got a beautiful home, I said quietly. Thank you, she replied, sitting down across from me. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something like relief, as if having me there broke a silence she'd been carrying. For a while, we talked about ordinary things, work, books, the garden. But underneath it all was the sense that this wasn't just about a squeaky hinge. It was about trust, about letting me step across a line that had always been marked by the fence between our houses. As I left later, she walked me to the door. Thanks for the help, she said, her voice softer now. I mean it. I nodded, feeling the warmth of her words settle deeper than they should. It wasn't the task that mattered, it was the invitation. The quiet way she had let me into her world, even if just for an afternoon. And as I stepped back into the sunlight, I couldn't help but feel that something had changed. Not just the door. Not just the silence. But the space between us. The rain had come suddenly that evening, sweeping across the neighborhood in sheets that rattled against rooftops and blurred the glow of the street lamps. I was heading back from the corner store with a bag tucked under my arm when I spotted her on her porch, standing just inside the shelter of the overhang. She leaned against the railing with a cup of tea in her hands, watching the storm with a faraway look. Caught in it too? She called as I jogged up the path, dripping and half laughing at my own bad luck. Yeah, I replied, shaking water from my jacket. Guess I should have checked the forecast. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the porch. Stay out of it a while. No sense in drowning. I joined her beneath the porch light, setting my bag down and leaning on the opposite railing. The rain filled the silence between us, steady and insistent, as if it wanted to press us closer together. From where I stood, I could see the fine mist gathering in her hair, tiny droplets catching the yellow light and glinting like stars. For a while, we simply listened to the storm. The world beyond her front yard disappeared into gray streaks of water and swaying shadows. There was something cocoon-like about it, as though the rain had drawn a curtain around us, leaving only the two of us standing there, suspended in our own pocket of time. It's funny, she said at last, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Most days I don't mind the quiet. But when storms roll in like this, it makes me aware of it. I turned to look at her. Aware of what? Her fingers tightened slightly around her mug before she answered. That it's just me here. People don't say it out loud, but once you're past a certain age, they stop seeing you as someone who can still feel things. Desire things. Like you've moved into another category of life altogether. She gave a short laugh, though it carried no humor. That's why I hate being called Mrs. It feels like a label I can't shake. Her words struck deeper than I expected. She wasn't teasing this time. She was letting something show, a raw edge of herself that most people never revealed in casual conversation. You don't seem that way to me, I said quietly. Not at all. She glanced at me then, her eyes searching my face as if weighing the sincerity of my response. The porch light softened her features, illuminating the lines etched by years of laughter and worry, and for the first time I saw not just her confidence, but her fragility beneath it. She gave a small smile, one that seemed both grateful and cautious. You're kind to say that. Without thinking, I reached out when she shifted her mug to one hand, my fingers brushing against hers for the briefest second. The warmth of her skin against mine was startling, grounding, and yet she didn't pull away immediately. Instead, her touch lingered, just enough to blur the line between accident and intention. The rain pounded harder, filling the silence as we both stood still. I felt my pulse in my ears, a thrum that matched the rhythm of the storm. Finally, she set her mug down on the railing and folded her arms, looking back at the rain. "I don't often admit things like that," she murmured. "But tonight, it just slipped out." I wanted to say more, to tell her she didn't need to hide those feelings, that she was anything but invisible, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stayed beside her, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her shoulder, listening to the storm until it softened into a drizzle. When I left later, the air smelled of wet earth and jasmine from her garden. Her words echoed in me, heavy and unforgettable. She wasn't just my neighbor, or someone older I admired from a distance. She was a woman who had let me glimpse her loneliness, her longing, and it felt like a door had quietly opened between us, one I wasn't sure either of us could close again. It was one of those evenings that felt impossibly still, the kind where the air itself seems to hold its breath. She had invited me over under the pretense of sharing tea and discussing a new book she'd picked up. The kitchen was warm, the faint scent of freshly brewed tea mingling with the soft aroma of baked cookies she had set on the counter. Everything about the space was comforting, yet charged in a way I hadn't anticipated. We sat across from each other at her small wooden table, the dim light from the hanging fixture above casting gentle shadows over her face. She poured tea with deliberate care, her fingers brushing the cup slightly longer than necessary before setting it in front of me. That simple touch, a casual graze of skin, sent a small, undeniable shiver up my arm. "Do you like it strong?" she asked, watching me with those sharp, observant eyes that seemed to measure everything without judgment. "Yes," I replied, unsure if I said it too quickly, aware that her gaze held me in a way that made every word feel heavier than it should. We sipped in silence for a few moments, the steam curling lazily between us. I tried to focus on the conversation, asking about her latest gardening project, but my attention kept wandering, back to her hand resting near mine, the gentle curve of her shoulder, the subtle way her hair fell across her cheek. Then, without warning, our hands brushed again as I reached for the sugar. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact lingered, just long enough to register, to send a quiet thrill through both of us, but short enough that we both pretended it was nothing. She cleared her throat lightly, a soft sound that somehow heightened the tension rather than breaking it. "People would never understand," she murmured, almost to herself. Her words hung between us, weighty and fragile. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the faintest flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a trace of hesitation. It was the kind of honesty most people kept buried. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance with a hand on her shoulder or a comforting touch, but I held back, aware that the boundary between us was delicate, fragile, even, and one wrong move could shatter it. Still, the silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was electric. Every glance, every small gesture, every near touch carried unspoken meaning. Her hand shifted slightly, resting near the edge of the table, and I noticed the way her fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. My own hand hovered nearby, as if drawn by some unspoken gravity. We talked in whispers then, words soft, measured, yet loaded with a tension neither of us named aloud. She laughed lightly at a comment I made, the sound low and melodic, and for a brief moment, her eyes met mine, lingering just long enough for unspoken understanding to pass between us. The kitchen, once ordinary and warm, felt like its own world. The teacups, the cookies, the dim light, they all faded into the background, leaving only the weight of proximity, the quiet magnetism of shared space, and the possibility of something deeper that neither of us was ready to claim. Finally, she stood to clear the table, giving me a small, almost imperceptible smile that carried a mixture of amusement, hesitation, and something else I couldn't name. "I suppose we should call it a night soon," she said softly, but her eyes betrayed the reluctance in her words. As I left her house, walking back through the cool night air, her words replayed in my mind, "People would never understand." And I realized that was only half the truth. It wasn't about others understanding, it was about the tension between us, unspoken yet palpable, a silent pull neither of us could deny. The moment lingered, electric and unresolved, leaving me with a single undeniable thought: something had shifted, and we both knew it. This was the moment the quiet tension between us became undeniable. A fragile thread of desire and curiosity stretched across the ordinary space of her kitchen, waiting for the right time, and courage, to be explored. The evening air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of wet grass from the neighborhood lawns. We had just left a small gathering at a friend's house, walking along the dimly lit sidewalks with no real destination in mind. Conversation had dwindled into comfortable silence, punctuated only by the occasional sound of distant laughter or a car passing by. Somehow, even in that silence, the tension between us felt almost tangible, like electricity hanging in the space just between our bodies. She walked slightly ahead of me, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, and I felt a subtle pull to stay close, yet I hesitated, not wanting to overstep. But then the ground shifted beneath her, a small uneven patch sending her foot twisting awkwardly. Without thinking, I reached out, catching her gently by the waist. The contact was fleeting, light, but it anchored both of us in a moment that felt suspended outside of time. For an instant, neither of us moved. The street lamps cast a soft, golden glow over her face, illuminating the curve of her cheek and the glimmer of surprise in her eyes. Her breath hitched slightly, not in fear, but in the awareness of our closeness. I felt the warmth of her body, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the faint scent of jasmine from her hair. It was a moment charged with more meaning than either of us could put into words. She didn't step back immediately, and neither did I. Instead, we lingered in that delicate proximity, held by the gravity of something unspoken. Her gaze met mine, searching, hesitant, yet bold in its own quiet way. "You make me feel young again," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the night. The words hit me like a wave, leaving me momentarily breathless. I wanted to answer, to say something that would encapsulate the mix of awe, longing, and caution that churned in my chest, but no words came. Instead, I let my gaze speak for me, the sincerity of my eyes and the gentle firmness of my hand on her back conveying all the hesitation, respect, and desire I felt. We began to walk again, slowly, almost deliberately, either letting go of the subtle closeness between us. Every step was measured, every glance heavy with meaning. The ordinary neighborhood streets had transformed into something intimate and private, a stage where we could allow ourselves to exist without pretense or expectation. For a while, conversation was unnecessary. The quiet rhythm of our steps and the shared warmth of our proximity said more than words ever could. I found myself memorizing the small details, the way her coat brushed against mine, the soft lilt of her laugh when she caught me staring, the way her eyes softened whenever they met mine. Somewhere along the way, the world outside her presence seemed to fade. The distant traffic, the faint hum of the streetlights, even the rustle of leaves in the trees became background noise to the gravity between us. In that suspended moment, it felt as if nothing existed except the two of us, walking slowly under the night sky, bound by a tension that had grown over days and weeks, now finally undeniable. When we reached her doorstep, either of us spoke immediately. She turned to face me, her expression a mixture of hope and caution, and our hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that hadn't existed before. "Tonight. I don't want to let this go," she said softly. I nodded, understanding everything she didn't need to say. No words could fully capture the depth of what we were feeling, but in the lingering squeeze of her hand, in the shared breath of anticipation, it was all there. That night, the tension that had built slowly, steadily, over countless quiet moments reached its emotional peak, an undeniable connection that neither of us could ignore, a spark that promised more, if we dared to see it through. The air was still, warmer than usual for an early evening, carrying faint traces of jasmine from her garden. After the night of unspoken tension and quiet confessions, we found ourselves standing on her doorstep again, a shared anticipation lingering between us like a tangible thread. There was no hurry, no pressure, only the weight of everything we had been feeling for weeks, now converging in a single, suspended moment. She opened the door slightly, just enough to let the light spill onto the walkway. Her eyes met mine, soft yet searching, and I realized in that instant that she was waiting, not just for me to step inside, but for us both to acknowledge what had grown between us. Her hand brushed against mine as she gestured toward the threshold, a subtle invitation, a gentle reassurance that we could cross into something new together. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. There was a vulnerability there I hadn't seen before, a glimpse of the woman behind the confident, composed exterior she always wore. I nodded, stepping forward carefully, my hand lingering in hers for a fraction longer than necessary. That small, deliberate touch said more than words ever could: presence, respect, trust, and a willingness to explore the uncharted space between us. Inside, the familiar warmth of her home enveloped us. The soft glow of the lamps, the faint scent of tea and flowers, the comfortable clutter of a life fully lived, it all felt like a sanctuary, a private world carved out for the two of us. We moved toward the living room, and she gestured for me to sit. I noticed the slight hesitation in her movements, the careful way she crossed her legs, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head as if weighing her next words. "I've been surprised," she began, sitting down across from me, "by how much I enjoy this, us being here together." Her eyes held mine steadily, vulnerability and courage intertwined in the soft curves of her expression. "I didn't expect it, and yet it feels right." I let her words settle before responding, choosing each syllable with care. "I feel the same. I've never met anyone like you. You make everything feel more vivid, more real." The honesty in my voice seemed to reach her, and for a moment, all that remained was the quiet acknowledgement of what we both already knew: something significant, tender, and rare had grown between us. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture. Instead, we moved closer naturally, drawn together by the gravity of mutual understanding. Her hand found mine again, and this time neither of us hesitated. The warmth of her touch, the gentle pressure of her fingers, felt like a promise, a quiet agreement that we were willing to see where this connection could lead. We talked then, softly, about what we wanted, what we hoped for, and the boundaries we were willing to respect. There was honesty in every word, a recognition that our lives were different, that the world might not fully understand, but that didn't diminish the bond we had forged. It was deliberate, careful, yet charged with the potential of something lasting. As the evening wore on, she leaned back slightly, resting her head lightly against the arm of the couch. I followed suit, my hand still holding hers, and we sat in a comfortable silence. The quiet was not empty, it was full of everything that had led us here: laughter, small touches, shared moments, and the slow, steady build of intimacy that had grown between us over weeks. Finally, she looked at me and whispered, "I don't know what comes next, but I want to find out, with you." I smiled, a mixture of relief, happiness, and awe. "Me too," I replied. And in that simple exchange, everything felt resolved. We weren't rushing, we weren't making promises we couldn't keep. We were simply allowing ourselves to exist in the space we had created together, fully present, fully connected. That night, as I left her home, the air felt lighter, warmer, and somehow charged with possibility. The tension, the hesitation, the longing, all had found a gentle resolution. Whatever came next, we had crossed the threshold of friendship, admiration, and curiosity into something deeper, a bond marked by respect, tenderness, and the quiet, undeniable pull of hearts choosing to meet halfway. 29L